Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw. One of the difficulties of podcasting is the audio. It's all audio. And so people are really aware of quality. There's actually this company, it's called Zencastr. And I actually do use Zencastr if I'm recording with, let's see, what have I done? I've done Bali, I've done India, I've done South Africa, I've done, of course, the US, UK. So it works. That's the great thing about Zencastr. You could get video as well in HD, no less. The link's in the description. Make it happen. Use the promo code ZEN, Z-E-N if you're Canadian, or Z-E-N if you're American. Do that, and you'll get 30% off. You get 30% off the first 3 months. Use it. Do it. Start your own podcast. I'm sure that if you start a podcast, I will listen to it, and I would not be surprised if it was better than shooting it raw. So check it out, Zencastr. There's this thing called Vinovest, and people are beginning to talk about it. It's on TechCrunch, Forbes, and what is it? It's basically people who invest in fine wine and make money off that. Fine wine is essentially, it's the best kept secret, right? Because wine doesn't really change in value all that much. It actually gains in value. So you actually get ownership of world-class wines, and it's attractive, and it's a really strong investment that wealthy people know all about this stuff. I mean, you get 500% returns. It's nuts. So Vinovest, links in the description as always. Check them out. Use Shooting It Raw as your promotional code. And if you do that, you'll get 2 months of no fees. So check out the website. You can see how it works and why wine is actually an amazing investment. And yeah, so check it out. You might just make a huge ton of cash. Hello world! One thing that's got a lot of attention are cryptocurrencies. And recently it's been these things called NFTs. And is this an ad for NFTs? Yes and no. I also created some NFTs with the podcast images, which you can find on OpenSea. And if you believe in this stuff, and if you think these investments can really amount to something down the line, check it out. They're not expensive now, but if you believe in shooting it raw, it might be a really great investment. As always, the link's in the description. Thanks.
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. The images in my field are really important because they're used scientifically to look at places over time, but they also provide a context for explaining places. They show things that are both natural and cultural intertwined within a single location. And I think that's really important because historically images have all kinds of weight attached to them in terms of their meaning and how they are used to define particular periods of human existence. And I think that now in this day where images are so common across our experience through social media, things like Instagram and Twitter and YouTube, I mean, we are creating stories of our times that people have never really been able to do in the past. And so it's really an exciting moment about place and about understanding place over shorter periods of time than we might have thought about in the past.
Okay, great. Okay, Robert Brinkmann. So you want me to call you Robert or Bob or?
Bob is fine. Yeah, Bob is good.
I'm getting close to episode 100. I think this is going to be episode 99 or something. So this is the last double digit. So that's you.
Wow.
So it's been, it's been a fantastic experience and how we came to meet was the incredible world we live in, right? You are quite literally thousands and thousands of miles away. I don't even know how to say the name of your town.
Yes, I live in DeKalb, Illinois. It's a small agricultural community. It's where a lot of back in the day barbed wire was manufactured in the United States. So it's the kind of I'm surrounded by industrial agriculture that builds the building blocks for methane or for ethanol,
Wow.
for fuel, and for animal production.
Wow.
But back, not that long ago, lots of small family farms, lots of local agriculture, and now it's all industrial. We're not that far from Chicago. It's about an hour and 20 minutes from Chicago. So it has connections with the urban Midwest, but it definitely is a rural community.
Amazing. So I'm going to get to know you. I love the fact that we live in a world where impossibly a guy who's born in Jerusalem, grew up in Montreal, moved to Hong Kong, somehow manages to meet you. And I'm going to join you on this incredible journey because so the cluster for the podcast at this point, because it reflects what I'm interested in, is around climate change, conservation, sustainability. And so in a way, I'm not going to try to pigeonhole you into any particular theme or anything. It's more about, okay, you're a human being on the other side of the world with your whole experience, and we're going to be entering the room that is your life, and you're just going to show us what's up there. And I'm really excited. I'm really happy to meet you.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me. Yeah, it's great.
So let's jump into the first photo, okay?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
So the first image that I have is, I don't look at them beforehand, so that the reaction is very kind of raw, right? So in this case, it's called Silver Spring.
Right.
Okay, so it's a landscape photo of, on the absolute right of the frame is a road with no shoulder or anything. And it looks like very thin pavement. And then there's like a kind of a ditch. And it's winter, but more fall. And then it leads to what is probably a stream, but it could be a lake, a small lake. The trees are all naked of their leaves. It's a gray day. Probably, it's hard to tell because it's overcast, so hard to know where the light is coming from. I would guess it's morning. Probably not yet hitting below, I speak in metric, so below zero, which in Fahrenheit is what, like 40 degrees?
32.
32. Yes. I'm learning already. 32. Okay. So, so why this image? What is this?
Well, I write a lot about sustainability, and the history of sustainability is built around the environmental movement. And the environmental movement itself has its roots in a little bit of romanticism around nature. So if you think about the Hudson Valley School of Art, which showed these grand views of nature with humans observing it, or if you think about Ansel Adams, a lot of Ansel Adams photographs were these beautiful images of nature. And I've traveled quite a lot around the world. And if you just take an Ansel Adams photo and just turn a little bit, you would have seen the impact of human activity. But he chose never to show it. He always showed nature as glorified. And all of my work throughout my life has been around showing nature as it really is, as impacted by humans. And that's why I picked this photo, because I feel like it is a little reminiscent of Ansel Adams or of the Hudson Valley School of Art, in that it has that kind of glorious image of nature, but it's also an ordinary image of nature that shows the imprint of humans on it.
Right.
when I was studying geology, I started to, when I was actually working as a geologist, one of the first things that I saw as a professional geologist as I was going out and doing my work is that it was really hard to do my work because the landscape was so altered. And I would go back to the office and say, it's hard to map the superficial features as natural because it's not natural. And I was working with geochemistry, and so finding natural was really important. And no one was really writing about this at the time. And I used to go to the Geological Society annual meeting, and there would be a handful of papers given around human impacts on the environment. And today, I would say almost the majority of them, when you go to the Geological Society of America annual meeting, are on human impacts. And so just in a short amount of time, the field has really transformed. And to me, that's what this image represents. It represents a space that is altered.
Well, here's how I'm going to connect to what you say, okay? This isn't an interview. It's a conversation. So I may not even ask a question, but I may talk for a while. So interesting that you anchor or reference Ansel Adams, because Ansel Adams is the grandpappy of exquisite imagery.
Oh yeah,
and of the landscape. And I grew up eating that stuff, really enjoying and appreciating it. And then the words come out of your mouth, I was studying geology, working as a geologist, and I'm literally hopping on my chair, eating the words that you're saying, because I'm like, yes. And here's what's interesting to me is that a person can look, aesthetically speaking, at an Ansel Adams photo and really get that high impact impression. But now, with that as a kind of the basic or the context that you've just sort of set out, when I look at this image, it kind of clearly gives the sense, you clearly have an understanding of art and design and aesthetics and the beauty of nature and landscape. But the image itself is quite beautiful, even though it's remarkably banal. It's basically a sort of backcountry road probably to somebody's backyard or something. You could see a couple of cars. It's gray. You could just see hints of color in the brown grass. And yet there's this kind of quiet solitude. And so that's what you're evoking, which I know you've thought about. So this is a very conscious creation. So how does this fit into your work?
Well, the other aspect of it is, I do a lot of editing around sustainability. And what I mean by that is that I produce a number of books where I invite people to write chapters or give ideas. And so I have a few of those out. I'm working on one right now. I'm working on one that is about 200 chapters around defining sustainability. Yeah, it's really a fun.
That's a monster.
It is a monster. It's coming out with Palgrave Macmillan. It's soon. It's actually being published as it goes along.
Okay.
And in doing so, I feel a little bit like, I don't know if you know William Cullen Bryant, who was an editor back in the 19th century, who did things like Picturesque America, and he did Collier's and several other things. And so what I mean by that is I feel like I'm helping to define the field. And I think it's important to have a particular viewpoint when you go into those kinds of things.
Okay.
And I think that this picture kind of represents my thinking around sustainability right now, is that we can't put nature back. I think a lot of people want nature. If you look, the Ansel Adams kind of represents a fetishized view of nature.
Okay,
in many ways, it's nature without people.
Yeah,
and if you think about that, it's hard to do that with the billions of people we have on the planet.
Agreed.
We just can't. And so, how do we create beauty? How do we create a reality? How do we create a livable world in harmony with nature with the cards that we're dealt right now?
Right.
And in some ways, there's a little bit of grieving that goes along with that. People have talked a lot about the grief that comes with knowing sustainability, knowing extinction, knowing
Sure.
what climate change does. I know you work a lot on sharks and
Mm.
shark issues. So the grief around what's happening with our ocean ecosystems.
Mm-hmm.
Now we can work to change it. We can work to
Mm.
make things better, but it won't be what it was.
No,
And
no,
I think
no.
this picture evokes a little bit of that.
Yes, I mean it's if you let yourself feel, and you know, there's definitely, because you're American, and part of your mythology, for example, is this idea of Thoreau separating himself for some kind of solitude in this pristine natural space. But the road is right there. You know, there's a
Exactly.
road, there's a car, there's like, it's beautiful and bleak. Wow, I had no idea this is going to be our conversation.
But it's true, though. I think that's important that we accept it and understand it.
Yep.
Because I think a lot of people who work on environmental issues want to go back to a particular point. Like, what is the right point we're at to get to?
Yeah.
And it's hard to do that. And I think we have to recognize that there is change, there is adaptation that is going on around us in nature. And we're part of that adaptation.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. Shall we move on to the next photo?
Sure.
Okay. I am loving this. Awesome. So the next image I have is okay. Wow. Okay. So the title is Sinkhole. And wait, let me also let's plug you mentioned books. So how many books would you say have your name embossed onto the cover?
I think around 8 or 9.
Wow.
I'm at the point where I'm losing track. So
no, that's beautiful.
Yeah, I have several of them. Most of them around sustainability. My latest one is called Practical Sustainability: A Guide to More Sustainable Living, which is
available on Amazon.
It is available on Amazon. Yeah, it's very inexpensive. It's a book that urges folks to take a deeper consideration on what they can do in their lives to live a more sustainable life. And I think a lot of people struggle with this because so many things are out of our control. Like if you look at the shark issue, I mean, just to go back to what one of the things you're concerned about sharks, I mean, a lot of that is dealing with corporatized fishing and things that one person can't change, but one person can make a difference by not eating shark fin soup or promoting it or working with companies that do so. And so it's thinking about little things that you can do, and through that way you help to transform culture. Can you hear me okay?
Our internet connection has frozen.
Am I okay?
Okay, you're back.
What was going on there?
I think what it is, you know, I am on the other side of the planet, but we're back. The conversation was going in one direction, but here we are back to photo number 2,
right?
Which is titled Sinkhole. So the image is, it's shot. First of all, it's probably midday. There are 2 bulldozers over what looks like used to be a home that has been destroyed. I don't know if it was destroyed. No, it probably wasn't destroyed from a tornado, because there are a bunch of trees around that are standing up perfectly fine. But the bulldozers have essentially completely demolished whatever the building or whatever it was before then. And the photographer is standing basically on a road that's kind of curled from left to right. But one would say that it's a pretty an anti-picturesque picture. So why are you including this sinkhole in a photo, or even called it sinkhole? Like, please explain this image.
Yes, this is an image of a house that was destroyed due to a sinkhole collapse in Florida, and so the house was destroyed, and there are emergency vehicles, there are bulldozers, and the house is being demolished as a result of the sinkhole. And the reason I pick this is I've done a lot of work in the state of Florida around sinkholes. Florida is one of the places in the planet where there are it's one of the most active areas for sinkholes. And sinkholes are part of a landscape called karst geology. And karst geology is geology of soluble rock and typically of limestone terrain. So you see a lot of karst features where you have caves and sinkholes and all kinds of other things. But in Florida, the sinkholes are active because it's a relatively recently emerged landscape from the ocean. And so the sinkholes are actively forming. It's similar to what you might see in the Yucatan Peninsula, although it's a little different. And it's a place where, if you look at the old air photos of the state, you see this really complicated geology associated with sinkholes, that the sinkholes were not necessarily just one single spot, but they were complex features that were interconnected and that were actively forming slowly over time. And so we've interposed development on top of them. And so you get this geology still happening, but because it's happening over dozens of years, people do not necessarily realize that they're building on top of an active geological landscape. Now, on top of that, climate change impacts this because you have changes in groundwater, you have changes in water table, changes in salinity of water, all of that. And so you end up with a landscape where that was active naturally, but then climate change and human change impacts the rate of sinkhole formation and the nature of sinkhole formation. And so to me, it evokes this idea of disaster around human-induced environmental change.
Right.
And the reason I think that this picture is interesting from a conversation viewpoint is that this is one person's tragedy, one family's tragedy, but look at all the infrastructure that's there to deal with it. And you think about this writ large, where you see the predictions of sea level change on major coastal cities. And we're already seeing some retreat back. I used to live on Long Island, and when Superstorm Sandy hit the island, the governor tried to get folks to retreat a little bit from the coastline, and there was some of that, and there were elevation of homes and a number of other things that occurred to make the coastline more resilient. But that involves millions and millions and millions of dollars. And so this picture to me brings up this conversation over the fact that we are in a time of change. It's super expensive. It causes us to think more about the needs of the individual versus the costs of the many.
Okay.
And
so,
so I'll leave it at that.
So one of the things that occurs to me are some problems around this, for example. It's basically how human habitation, where people live and form their cities and living spaces, merge with the environment. Is the problem so big that it can't really be looked at strategically, that it is always like tactically, like, oh, the house just sank and got demolished? And yeah, it's tragic because the person there really suffered. Or for example, another guest that was on, he was a good friend of mine, and he was in Houston when I think it was Hurricane Harvey or something created this immense flooding, and his house was demolished. And so what in your training lets you address things like tactically versus strategically? Do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. And it's a really interesting and an in-depth question. And I have to go back to some work that I've done with the United Nations. I was asked, I was asked several years ago to take a look at all the national sustainability plans that were built for every country. And I read them and I spent a lot of time with them and tried to gather some knowledge on what they were all doing. And then I had the opportunity to hear a number of different countries present their sustainability plans at the United Nations. So the people who develop the plans, or the political leaders or the technical leaders, develop them.
Wow.
And what was
respect.
Yeah, it was really an amazing experience. And what I really learned from that is that there were some countries, especially wealthy countries, that are very able to develop some great sound plans and put them into place and make some strong actions, and some other countries that are not so wealthy that were able to do it. But then you had countries that developed these really amazing plans, but at the end of the day, they said, well, we can't really do anything because our country's in conflict, or the
Right.
national government isn't strong enough to really enact these sustainability initiatives. And I feel like in some ways, a lot of what we've been doing the last 20, 30 years around climate change globally is kind of like that. Like, if you look at the various climate agreements, they get us to a certain point, but it's never enough, right?
Mm, mm.
And if you look at a lot of the emerging environmental issues, even if you look at I have to go back to the shark issue, the international agreements are not strong enough.
Right.
And there's a lot of talk, there's a lot of good intent, but when it comes down to actually doing things and making a
Mm.
difference, we're not quite there yet. I'm reminded of the artist Isaac Cordell, who did this great piece called "Politicians Discussing Climate Change," and there's these little
Yeah.
figures that are slowly getting covered with water,
Yep. Yep.
and I feel like that represents the last 30 or 40 years around environmental policy.
Mm. And it's funny, as you're saying that, I was reminded of, is it Churchill who said that, Americans do the right thing after they've tried all the other options or something like that, right? But isn't that like a human thing though? Isn't that like in a way, people are like, how far can we go to the edge of the table before we're going to fall off?
Right.
And then once the urgency is there. So, for example, to quote an inspiring Canadian, David Suzuki, I mean, he was one of the first real scientists and conservationists when I was a kid that really sort of caught my attention. And his foundation, their byline is solutions are in our nature, right?
Right.
And so it's very optimistic, and it's something beautiful to live up to. And so, as we're having this discussion, I'm looking at these two bulldozers that are on this road in Florida that you described, clearing out this sinkhole. So what do you say? Like, what is a policy approach that would be able to say, okay, you know what? We have to rethink how we build our cities, or, I mean, isn't it seems like such a massive undertaking.
It is, and if you think about this writ large around coastal development or development along floodplains, I mean, we have tons of rules and regulations around it, but at the end of the day, people are willing to take the risk,
Yep.
and that's the piece that is tough, because if you have the risk and you lose, there's the expectation you'll have help.
Okay.
But
Yeah.
But when we're looking at the magnitude of the kinds of problems that are likely to occur over the next 50 years, we're not going to be able to help people like we are
Okay.
now. And I think that that's an important aspect. I mean, we can do some, but can we really move the millions of people from the coastline in decades,
Well, okay, so I don't know if you picked this up, but my wife and I were in Sri Lanka when the 2004 tsunami happened, and we were just having a vacation. We're taking surfing lessons, and then the tsunami happened, and it literally leveled the coastline of many countries.
Right.
And
Terrible.
And so, for example, if we had said to the people there who had just set up their bed and breakfasts or whatever, and saying, hey, listen, you're on a coast that is potentially, you can't even anticipate, the tsunami is going to happen like next year, that's going to wipe this all away. You have to kind of create, like, in a way, don't you feel like people would it's way too complex to try to anticipate all the potential dangers, and maybe that's one of the barriers?
I think that's true. I mean, if you think about a tsunami, occurring. If you were in that bed and breakfast and somebody said, "Look, a tsunami's coming in a few minutes, get to higher ground,"
Right.
you would go.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what we're saying right now with coastal environments. Is we're saying, look, the sea level is going to rise in the next
it's
few
coming.
decades. You make some decisions now, and we're not making them. Some are.
Right.
There is some migration away from the coastline, but many people are not. Now, part of that is because, I've lived on the coastline. It's fantastic to live on the ocean. It's great.
Yep.
It's beautiful. There's all kinds of personal gain from living on the coastline. So I get it. But the costs of that and the infrastructure costs are really tremendous for society.
Right. Ooh, light topic. No, but you know what? I am not one to shy away from looking at a problem right between the eyes and still feel optimistic. So, because one of the things that I picked up from your energy is you are buoyant and you are, I don't know, you're engaged. So, want to move on to the next photo?
Yeah, it's more optimistic. I will say that.
Okay. Okay, well, this one's called Sauerkraut.
Exactly.
And it's a photograph, with a very wide angle shot of the main focus of the image is like a very, very large pot. And I'm assuming that's sauerkraut at the bottom of the pot. And it's in a kitchen with nice green shelving. There are two people. One person's at a sink. One person's behind cooking. This looks like a home kitchen. It's, outside it looks kind of sunny. People are in t-shirts. So it's probably I don't know. Okay, so sauerkraut. What is this?
Yeah, this is my kitchen at home. This is my husband and my mother-in-law, and this is a Saturday, and what we do on Saturdays is we work on food, and we really try to make a difference with the food choices we make. And my latest book, which is Practical Sustainability, covers a lot of things that we can each do to save the planet, and we can all do little things because it's easy to be overwhelmed by the things that we were just talking about, the things. Yeah. The challenges that we face. But if you take individual action, it makes you feel good. It makes you happy. It makes you recognize that you are personally making a difference. And in our life, we really try to explore new things around sustainability. We've been doing Meatless Monday for years. Okay. We've gone to our meatless 2 or 3 or 4 days a week. We can't quite get ourselves to vegan or vegetarian, but I think that that's an important thing to acknowledge with a lot of people, is that they want to do something. They might not want to change their lives to fully be vegetarian, but I think it's important to recognize that if they just went vegetarian or vegan for 1 day a week, 2 days a week, that has a huge impact on the climate. It has an impact on land use, all kinds of things. So if we could get a million people doing that, that's a huge difference right there, overnight. Right. And in our case, we've been exploring a little bit with fermented vegetables, which is what this one is all about. We were playing with sauerkraut that day, making sauerkraut.
Nice.
And the idea that we can have fun doing that, we can do it as a family. There are things that you can do even under quarantine or conditions, although we hopefully will be coming out of that soon. But the idea that we in our own households can make changes that make a positive difference to the planet as opposed to a negative difference.
Right. So, for a while, decades ago, one of the slogans was think global, act local. And these things come and go into fashion. And it's almost as if we've outgrown them. But do you feel that, particularly you who have actually seen as professionally, you have been mobilized to actually go to different places and to go deep into the complexities of what are the environmental challenges. And it can be overwhelming. and yet something about you is optimistic, is positive, is engaged. And yeah, so you do your best. Have one day a week where you're not eating meat, or 2 days a week, or 3 or 4, just that you actually try, and by that way you become engaged at a local level, right? So I don't know if there's a question there, but why don't you take it from there? Take the baton.
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. I think that I think we live in such a world where we've given up a lot of our responsibilities, personal responsibilities, to organizations that do virtuous things for us. If we
Okay.
think about, let's say you want to invest money, you don't invest it directly yourself in a company. You might put it in a mutual fund or something like that, and you expect that mutual fund company to do good things with your dollars. Or if
Right.
you're buying food from a grocery store, you expect the grocery store to manage your food ethically. We're very divorced from our food production.
Right.
And I think it's important to try to take control of that a little bit in our lives, to make where you are making choices that matter to you. We've given up so much of that. I mean, if you think about our meat production, at least in the United States, and I know in many parts of the world, it's heavily industrialized. And I
Right.
think anyone who had a sense of empathy, that was a meat eater, if I could take them to the places where the meat is produced, they
Sure.
would probably try to reduce their meat consumption just because of what they would see.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
And I think it's important for us, whenever I teach sustainability, I try to show the reality of things, of the choices
Mm-hmm.
that people make. That if you like to go clothes shopping, well, let's go deeper into that, where the clothes are produced, and the impacts on the labor markets, and the impacts on the fast fashion, on the waste stream, and
Mm-hmm.
the chemicals that are produced through dyeing, and how the dyes are polluting groundwater and drinking water around the world. And once you understand that, you take a little bit more responsibility for your own actions. And I think that's a big part of what sustainability is all about, is really owning your choices.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so just to give some context, what is the population of the town you live in?
It's a few thousand people.
Okay, a few thousand.
Well,
Okay.
a few tens of thousands of people, excuse me.
Okay. And you're an educator. You're a
Correct.
teacher. You're associated to university. Yes.
Correct. I'm the
Okay.
dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the Northern Illinois University.
Beautiful. Yeah. Okay. So how do you make real? So, for example, a new student, like an 18, 19, 20-year-old who sits in your class. Sorry if you only teach PhDs. Sorry.
No. I love teaching intro courses. It's my favorite.
Okay. So how do you connect them who is not, if they haven't seen the world, and maybe they haven't, to this idea that, hey, look, we live in a really big, massive, planet, but actually the biosphere is this little film of life on this huge rock, and the balance is quite delicate. So how do you connect each individual person to the things that you've seen to feel responsible and motivated and engaged?
Wow, that's a really good question. It is, and it's an important one. But I think a lot of times they already have that connection.
Okay.
It's really framing it out. All of us have a connection with nature in some way, and I think that the younger generation, they've been growing up with this idea of environmental change.
Okay.
They understand that they live in an altered world, and an unfair world. That's another aspect of sustainability, is the idea of
Right.
equity within this. And my university has about 50% first generation college students that come
Okay.
to it. And I used to be at a university that was a private university with a lot of really great students that were highly privileged, that were very different from that group. And this group where I'm at now, they understand issues of equity in a very different way.
Mm-hmm.
and see issues of environmental injustice and recognize the global nature of it in ways that I think are really significantly different from previous generations. So it's building the connections. I mean, talking about things like the Flint water crisis, or talking about things like electronic waste and showing the connections from the local to the global, I think are really important. Talking about plastic waste and how microplastics are getting into drinking water globally, talking about plastic recycling and how our choices to be consumers of plastic water bottles leads to waste problems around the world. All of those things build connections that provide deeper understanding. But within that, it's really important to also build a sense of hope, because I don't try to sugarcoat it and say that we're going to go back to a perfect world. I go back to the first image that I picked, is we do live in an altered world. It's just, what can we do to make our lives more meaningful, more healthy, and so that we do limited damage to the planet while we're here.
Right. Okay. So many roads. And the issue with a 1 hour podcast is it goes by really quickly.
I know.
I could talk to you for years. Okay. So what do you feel? I mean, it's a liberal arts college, or liberal arts faculty, or
liberal arts college, liberal arts and sciences. Okay. Yeah.
So explain to the listener who has no concept of why a liberal arts is different from any other kind of university. Like, what is it that's unique about the liberal arts curriculum that might awaken things?
The liberal arts and sciences are the core of most universities. It's the things that include the humanities, the social sciences, the natural sciences, as well as interdisciplinary centers. It doesn't include things like business or health or education or engineering or some of the other applied colleges you might see at other universities. So it is the basis of the traditional knowledge that you would learn at a university. And in the United States, the idea of a liberal arts education, liberal arts and science education, goes back to the early founding of universities here. And so we're responsible for the general education that most students get. So in the United States, the way that we do it is that we have majors, but within the major, you have to take around 30 to 60 hours of liberal arts courses that are broad-based, that provide a foundation of breadth of knowledge, so students are widely educated so that they can be good citizens.
Well-rounded.
Yeah.
We're going to move on to the next photo because, so let's connect. I know this is, I kind of enjoy doing connecting things that don't make sense together. So, okay, I'm going to put 3 words together and then you synthesize a statement from that. Okay. So the pristine biosphere, damaged shorelines, and making sauerkraut at home on the weekend. What is the thread that connects them all?
I think it's hope. I think it's the idea that we have a world that is changed, but that through it we persevere. I mean, I've traveled a lot in the Middle East and South America, Europe, and one of the things that I see over and over again, I know you've traveled a lot and I'm sure you've seen it, is the persistence of humanity. And the very first place I traveled internationally was to Yemen, which is a weird first place to go, but that's my story. And so, I grew up in a really small town of 2,000 people and went to Yemen, and it was.
I love it.
It was great. I think I was well suited for that experience, actually. But what was so impressive about that trip is just seeing the layers of history over time, and that there was persistence throughout really difficult environmental conditions.
Right. So when you went to Yemen, the sort of the filter or the lens you're seeing through I mean, I don't know if it was a tourist trip or if it was a learning trip, but your perception of time and history and the environment must have been through your geological training.
Yeah, I was actually lucky enough to be the team geologist on an archaeological crew that was looking at ancient agricultural settlements in outside of Marib.
Amazing.
And I don't know if you know
Amazing.
Yemen very well, but it's on the edge of the desert
Yeah.
near the border with Saudi Arabia,
Wow.
and heavily populated back in pre-Islamic days, and
Yeah.
just amazing footprint of people on the landscape going back thousands of years.
Hmm.
And those footprints are all over the world, not just in Yemen, but the impact of human activity is everywhere,
Right.
and people are resilient through that.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. Somehow you managed to connect sauerkraut to Yemen. Amazing. Amazing. Okay. So since I said sauerkraut, I think it's time to move on to the next image.
All right.
Okay. I like how you think. I don't know you, but I like how your brain put this together. It's okay. So it's an image made high noon kind of style. Could be. It's dominated by what looks like a concrete bench of rocks put together. I can just barely see some inscription on, like, carved into one of the stones. And behind it is this tree. I don't know the exact species of the tree, and there are some other trees with larger trunks. The ground is mostly sort of brushed. It's flat. I mean, for all I know, this image was made down the road from the first image, because just far in back, I can see what could be like a lake or a river. I wish I could read the inscription. Maybe you'll tell me what it is, but what is the significance of this one? And it's called Connections.
Yeah, this is a bench on our campus, on the Northern Illinois
Okay.
University campus, and it's a bench that was built by a class back in the near the turn of the 19th century. So it was 19th, 20th century. So it was around
Wow.
1905, 1906.
Wow.
And students over the years get their picture taken at that bench. And one of the things that drove me to pick this one is that as dean, I get to make connections with people, with alumni, and our current students in ways that I might not normally get to have those types
Sure.
of connections. And there was a gentleman an alumni who graduated. He's from India. He came here as an international student back decades ago, and I had the opportunity to reach out to him and just talk to him about his experiences and what some advice. I wanted to seek his advice on some directions from his major and all the rest. And I dug up some information about him, and I found a photo of him sitting at that bench with his friends.
Okay.
And this is somebody who came without much. He had a job in our college as a technical kind of support person back
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 decades ago. And there he is in this photo with his buddies, many of them from India, in this small town in northern Illinois in the middle of nowhere, right?
Wow.
And he's had an incredibly successful career and has been very generous to the university.
Mm-hmm.
And I just think that image just shows that a lot of people walk through spaces, very normal spaces, but have their lives transformed in some ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And
Okay. Yeah.
and we all have those places that we know of that are important to many, many people that walk through. In Chicago, the Bean, I don't know if you're familiar with the Bean, Chicago's just down the road from where I live. And
Okay.
there's this sculpture right on the lakefront called the Bean. It's this beautiful steel sculpture. It's big. You can walk under it and it's reflective and you see the reflection of the city. And people go there. It's a touchstone, and lots of people have walked through that. If you go to New York, I used to live in New York. If you go to Rockefeller Center or to Times Square, these touchstone places that people have that connect us through time.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just about while we're here, but it's also going back. hundreds of years. Where the bean is in Chicago is very near where the first settler established Chicago. It's where Native Americans also had a central focal settlement. There were Native Americans on our campus prior to the settlement by Europeans. And so it's thinking of places over time, I think, that we're walking through this space, the impacts that we're having now, but we're not sure what the future will bring. So it's these connections with time and space that I think I wanted to evoke in that idea. If you think about Madonna, Madonna is such a big superstar, but her first, and she's with us, she's still active, but her first album is closer to World War II, the end of World War II, than it is to now.
Right.
And that amount of change that we have over time is big.
Yes. Okay. So here's what's an interesting thing, because I meet you, I start getting access to how you think and how you see the world. And I know that your training is about looking at systems that change very, very slowly, or the scales of the time scales are like hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. So as a geologist, you can read a landscape on these massive scales. And then even like this bench that is so heavy, and it's like cement with massive stones, right? So even if it's 100 years old, would barely register as a blip, right? In terms of archaeological time or whatever. And yet one of the sensibilities you're bringing that's weaving through is this notion of connection, and this notion of humans putting an imprint on the landscape and also being imprinted by the landscape. So when I see this image and hear you talking about it, I connect it to, for example, walking around Jerusalem, right? So you walk around the old city and you can literally step on stones that were worn down from, Roman, if not older, technology, 2,000 or 3,000 years old. And you're there walking around drinking a Coke. So it's that connection over time as well. Okay. For me, this is the real privilege to have somebody who's like, I understand books and synthesizing books, and you have like 8 or 9 books. And so what I'd like for you to do is evoke in a listener what fuels you to, for example, your most recent book. Like, what was the motivation that really kind of guided you to collect these works into a text, and why should people go out and read it?
Well, I think it's because there's so much beauty in the world right now. And
nice, yes.
And I think that's what motivates me, is to try to protect the beauty as much as we can, and also to recognize that the world is beautiful with us in it. There was a book written a few years ago. It was so depressing. It was called The World Without Us. I don't know if you remember that book 10, 20 years ago. But it was basically written by somebody who studies stuff like what I study, that said, what would happen to a variety of different things if people disappeared from the planet one day? And it looked at things like nuclear power plants or water systems or whatever. And it was really an interesting book, but the world has us in it, and the world is not going to disappear. If you study geology, we see extinction. You could study the fossil record and you see things come and go. And maybe we're at a point where we might be partially going away. I don't know. I don't want to predict that, but we're certainly in a time of major change. And whether or not we can navigate through it is a big question mark. And we could certainly build the tools to navigate through that effectively through making smarter choices, like eating less meat and driving less and having a smaller footprint on the planet, all of those kinds of things. There are things we can do. And I think that just taking charge of our lives in a more thoughtful way helps us make sense of the world right now.
full on, full on. I love it. I absolutely love it. I had no idea, and thank you so much for sharing this. This is great.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
So the links are going to be to your books, to your work, and I really hope the listener will go check it out, because just from your emails, your energy comes through. I think I even wrote that to you. I said, you seem so switched on. Like it just, I that personally is hugely motivating. So now we have this connection.
I love it. Thank you so much.
Shooting it raw?
Yes. Shooting it raw.